Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar hosted by the Southern IPM Center. As part of the USDA NIFA Crop Protection and Pest Management Program, we are providing these webinars as an opportunity for scientists to share successes from their projects. Today, Austin Hagan, professor and extension plant pathologist at Auburn University, is going to talk about the results of his 2-year research project on Target Spot, which was funded by a USDA NIFA Applied Research and Development Program grant. Dr. Hagan is an alumni professor at Auburn and is responsible for the diagnosis, monitoring, and development of disease and nematode control strategies for peanut, cotton, cereal, grain, and forage crops, in addition to other responsibilities. He will discuss management strategies for Target Spot in cotton based on disease distribution and current tools that are available. So, Dr. Hagan, you want to take it from here?
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to talk about some of the work we've done on trying to develop control strategies for Target Spot in cotton. And Target Spot is an emerging disease in cotton at this point in time. It actually was described about 55 years ago in Mississippi, but it essentially disappeared. And for example, you won't see any references in it in the current cotton compendium. It reemerged in Georgia about 8 or 9 years ago and showed up in Alabama in 2011 and was statewide by 2012. And it has continued to spread around the region since then. And as of this past year, it's occurs in essentially all of the southern states where cotton is grown, except with the exceptions, at least I'm aware of, Texas. But this same disease has popped up in Brazil and China, and the causal fungus, Corneospora cassicola, also causes a boll rot in India in cotton. So just as a primer, I just want to let you know about what the Alabama cotton crop extent of it is in the state. We had a record yield this year, large acreage. Most of the acreages, if you look on the right-hand side of the map, most of the acreage is in the southern part of the state, and particularly in the lower tier counties is where you're going to see some issues with Target Spot. So it's right down primarily in this area. We have some Target Spot here. And then the disease essentially fades out as you go further north. Now, there are some exceptions to that, and we'll get to that later. The fungus itself is found worldwide. Basically, anywhere major crops are grown, it has a very broad host range, and it's a plant pathogen, saprophyte and endophyte, and actually has been identified as a human pathogen from one time or another. And for those of us in the United States, it mainly has been historically a problem in vegetable crops, particularly tomatoes and cucumbers. But we have had historical issues with it in soybeans, and now it has popped up in cotton. The fungus itself is what we call a nematoeaceous hypomycete. In other words, the fungus hyphae and the conidia are pigmented. It usually, if you look at the spores under a microscope, which you can see up here in the upper corner, they kind of have a gray cast to them. They're very large for a conidia, maybe up to 200 microns in length. So they're really not the type of conidia that's transmitted particularly readily by wind, maybe splashing water in a thunderstorm for local distribution, possibly a major weather system, a tropical storm, for example, may be able to move a spore cloud from, say, Georgia up the East Coast. And the fungus is sporulates well on the surface of the lesions, and the large conidia can be seen with a hand lens pretty readily, and they refract light, so they're pretty easy to see when you're examining a piece of tissue. There's been some issues with where the isolate from cotton fits within the whole family of Corneospora cassicola. And it turns out it's in a phylogenetic linkage 1. There are 6 linkages. It's in number 1, which in addition you find soybeans and a few other crops are in that particular area. it turns out that the isolates from cotton are not very genetically diverse, as you can see from the consensus tree, and they're distinct from other populations on other hosts. Now, they're somewhat closely related to soybean, but still very specific for cotton, and it looks like that this particular strain or isolate is either a new introduction or an evolution from an existing strain. But at least at this point in time, no one really knows where this particular fungus originated. As I said, it showed up in Georgia, and we've had issues with it ever since. We really don't have a link back to the original material to know whether the isolates in Mississippi are the same as the ones we have found in Georgia, and then subsequently the rest of the Southeast. There's work going on right now. We have some graduate students doing some epidemiological studies to try to get an idea as to what type of conditions drive the infection, leaf colon or tissue colonization, and symptomatic expression of target spot. So that's ongoing. For those of us who work in the field, though, as far as weather patterns are concerned, it's frequent rain or showers with or without irrigation. So in situations where we get a lot of rainfall at certain times of the year, then we're very likely to see a great deal of target spot development in cotton. And that's an annual weather pattern here in the Southeast, particularly the closer you get to the coast. We have heavy rains in those areas. We have convection thunderstorms virtually every day, and in the coastal southern region, very favorable conditions for target spots. So it's an annual occurrence in that area. When you get a little further away from the coastal south, then it takes a certain set of weather patterns to really drive the disease, like we had in 2012 and 2013 in the mid-Atlantic states, where we had some tropical storms moving up the coast and very likely were responsible for disease development in those areas. And then similarly, we had the same situation in the Mid-South this past year, where in the Mississippi River Valley, there was a tremendous amount of rainfall between June and into the middle of August, and again, providing very conducive conditions for the development of target spots. So outside of that coastal region, we're going to have some really wet weather patterns in order to drive the disease. One of the other parameters that we find associated with disease outbreaks is very early canopy closure. When that canopy covers, you get a lot of moisture being held within the canopy, then you tend to see very rapid disease development in conjunction with the rainfall. And typically, you'll see symptoms between the first and fourth week of bloom. Usually, it's more along the lines of the third or fourth week in bloom. And the disease specifically is an issue in high-yield cotton, intensively managed high-yield cotton. If you go out and look at cotton where the canopy never laps the middle, it has a yield potential of maybe 1.5, maybe up to 2 bales. Normally speaking, you see very little target spot in those situations. But where the canopy laps the middle very rapidly, you're talking about cotton where the growers are pushing at least a 3 bale level, maybe up to 4 bales per acre. That cotton with that huge canopy is very sensitive to target spot, and that's where we see a lot of our problems. Last year in Alabama, we had studies at these 4 locations, and at Fairhope or Gulf Coast, we had a tremendous amount of rain over the course of the summer, had a lot of disease development. Bruton, which is about 40 or 50 miles north of Pensacola, had not quite as much rain, but it rained fairly frequently. Had a lot of disease there. Move into central Alabama, at Field Crops Unit outside of Montgomery, we had a concentration of rain in July, a little bit in July and August, but not a lot of rain, and essentially limited target spot development. And then in North Alabama, where essentially we went into a drought in June and had to irrigate heavily just to maintain the cotton, we had no disease development at all. So it appears that, again, you have to have a lot of rainfall to really drive the disease. In a dry conditions with irrigation, you're just not going to see a lot of target spot. Another way to look at it, there are different risk zones, at least for Alabama, high, medium, and low. And again, they correspond to those areas where we have high and then declining amounts of rain. And in the high level area, you might see yield losses of 10 to maybe 15%. You get into the medium risk zone, maybe 5%, somewhere in that range. And then in North Alabama, for example, unless we have the right set of weather patterns, which we have not had since I started working on this disease 4 years ago, very little loss, if any, to target spot. So it's very much a rain-driven disease. I mentioned onset of disease. This is just some data from a 2015 study at Bruton. And each of the icons is a rating date and data from a rating date. And the third week in bloom, which is essentially the 21st of July, there were no symptoms in the field. Went back a week later, we started to pick up the disease, and at that point, we had very rapid disease development, particularly on some of these more susceptible lines, and a good bit less defoliation in rate of disease development on some of these more resistant lines, like some of these delta pines. So there is a differential rate of disease development depending on the variety in the field, and some varieties are very sensitive. Some of them actually seem to have very good tolerance to target spot. This will give you an idea of the progression of the disease. In cotton, the third week in bloom, there's actually a few lesions down here on the lower leaves. If you come back 2 weeks later, you're starting to see a fair amount of leaf shed and the canopy starting to open up. 2 weeks after that, which would be about the end of August, third week in August, you're at 50% defoliation. The canopy is very open, and then you come back 2 weeks later, and you're about 75 to 80% defoliation. So, as you can see in this slide and the previous one, on a susceptible variety, the rate of disease development is very rapid, given the right weather patterns. The disease gets its name from the distinct ring spot or target or bullseye pattern associated with the lesion, and essentially these rings form every time the fungus actually grows out into the surrounding tissue. There are some other diseases that have similar symptoms, so you have to, and I'll touch on those in a minute. But as I mentioned before, you're going to see your symptoms down here in the lower third of the canopy, about the third or fourth week in bloom, and you have very rapid movement of the disease up through the canopy, up towards the shoot tips within about a 4-week period of time. The earliest symptoms you see are actually these gray circular lesions, sometimes with a green halo around them. Those lesions will dry into that brick red color. You can get some leaf blighting under really ideal conditions, but normally the spots are very discrete in size and color. As the disease progresses, those leaves begin to senesce, and then they hit the ground in large numbers. Another symptom pattern showed up this past year in the Mid-South, and this is something that I have not seen in Alabama, even under severe disease conditions. And that was what they call target spot drop, or basically where the plants were shedding immature or mature bolls, as you can see in the lower right-hand side, even shedding some squares. And in the upper right, another image from Arkansas showing basically the same thing. And if you look at the cotton plants, a lot of times you can see small lesions on the bracts, on the squares, and a lot of times these can be attributed to infection by Coniospora cassicula. So the disease is not only knocking leaves off, it may be knocking squares, and then in the case in the Mid-South, they were actually losing bolls. The look-alike diseases that you see from time to time in cotton, we have Cercospora leaf spot, we have target spot. Here, Myrothecium leaf spot, almost identical. Ascochyta leaf blight, Staphylococcus leaf spot are all occur in cotton during the course of the year. With Ascochyta, you can actually see the rings of the pycnidia, so it's really easy to distinguish this disease from target spot. But when you come into a disease like Staphylococcus leaf spot, where you just have the same type of target pattern, you have to really look at these with a microscope. So this is just kind of a seasonal distribution of the diseases in cotton. Ascochyta is usually early in the season. Cotton maybe up to maybe a foot tall. Then that disease tends to drop off. Then you might pick up Cercospora and Myrothecium really around the time that the cotton is starting to lap the middles, but I really don't see it any later than that. Staphylococcus tends to be a late season disease that may be associated with a late season potash deficiency or potash shock, and then target spot develops usually in the middle of July, and then usually by about the 1st of September it's run its course. So the question with target spot is, the first question is, does it impact yield? Cotton actually, target spot acts as a natural defoliator. If it actually developed later in the season, we would consider it a beneficial disease, and then it would open the canopy up, allow the bulbs to open up, and reduce humidity in the canopy, which might reduce hardlock. But it doesn't work out that way because the fact that the disease shows up so early during the or middle of the growth of the plants, and it does have an impact. And at the Gulf Coast substation, we've done a number of trials where we've looked at the relationship between defoliation and yield loss. And what we have here in all these slides is actually a relative area under the disease progress curve for defoliation, but it's basically the same statistic. And in some studies, we get a significant but not the greatest relationship between yield loss and defoliation. But in some of the other studies, we get a very highly significant relationship between those two variables. And it turns out that if you look at the slopes of these lines, we have anywhere in some of these trials from about a 250 to maybe up to a 350 pound per acre loss in lint, and that translates into a loss of about 170 to about $300 an acre in lost income to the grower. So this disease, with the right variety in the right place, can greatly reduce the yield of cotton. If you look at some of the other parameters which influence cotton yield, one of them is turnout or gin out. And in some of the trials we've run, we actually find that the fungicide-treated cotton has a higher turnout rate or gin out rate than the non-treated control, which tend to accentuate the yield benefit that you would derive from a fungicide input. Another parameter we've looked at is bulb counts. We looked at bulb set, open bulbs at the end of the season, and for example here in the red box we've got a control and a Paraxor umbrella program to take target spot out, and we see a nice increase in the number of open bulbs with the Paraxor treatment compared with the control. No difference in unopened bulbs, and the fungicide, this is seed cotton yield, not lint yields, increased yield by about 200 pounds per acre, which is about 80 pounds of lint per acre, I think. We've also looked at fiber quality. Of course, this adds or can detract from the value of the lint. And if you look at the 0, 1, and 2 application programs with headline, there's really no difference in mite, fiber length, fiber strength, or uniformity. Now, we get the fungicide numbers up all the way, we can show some differences. But there's really not that much impact of the disease on fiber quality. So overall, based on the yield loss work we've done, there is a decline in seed and lint yield with increasing defoliation. It is particularly noticeable on some varieties as compared with others, with Phytogen 499 being our susceptible control at this point in time. You may see some impact of defoliation on bulb counts. There are differences. We don't know whether the bolls are being shed or whether they're just not being formed. We need to do mapping studies to see where the bolls are developing and where if they're falling away. We don't have any information on square set of retention or boll dimensions because they may also play into our boll set. As I mentioned before, the gin-out rates can be influenced by defoliation, but I would say in a lot of the trials that we've run over the past couple of years, we really don't see a close association between those two variables. And fiber quality can be, but not greatly influenced by disease. So that brings us to target spot management. How are we going to deal with this disease in cotton? For a plant pathologist, really and truly, the most effective means of managing a disease of this sort is with variety selection. So we're looking for a tolerant or resistant variety. We want to make use of the germplasm that we have out there to minimize the cost of the grower while managing the disease in the most efficient manner. There are some situations where fungicides may be needed. You get down into South Alabama, the Panhandle of Florida, or Georgia, we get into a really wet summer. It may not matter what variety's out there because all of them, given the right weather patterns, are vulnerable to target spot and subsequent yield loss. And then another point is there are other management inputs involved in growing cotton, and the interest is trying to establish whether any of the other management practices that we utilize to grow cotton are of any value, either minimizing the amount of target spot we get in cotton, or they may be making the disease worse. So that's something that actually that work is still ongoing. So when you look at varieties, as I mentioned before, they do differ in their sensitivity to target spot. If you look at this chart, there's 6 varieties here. This is a 3-year study looking at a non-treated control, a fungicide program, an umbrella fungicide program, and looking at defoliation. And we got a reduction in target spot on all the varieties except for Delta Pine 1137. If you look at the Phytogen 499, it certainly had untreated. It had a much higher level of defoliation than any of the other varieties untreated, except for the Fibermax 1944. But essentially, the other 5 varieties had similar levels of defoliation, and they're much lower than the 499. So they're seem to display equal tolerance to the disease. And then when we put a fungicide on each of these 5 varieties, we got a reduction in target spot, as we did on 499. But you noted the 499 treated with a fungicide had the same level of defoliation as the other 5 varieties. So there's a definite advantage for identifying and utilizing these more tolerant varieties in a production setting. And this set of slides just illustrates what we see in the field when we look at target spot damaged cotton, or the differences among varieties as far as the levels of defoliation. And here's 499 treated and untreated. There's clearly a difference in leaf retention on this variety. There's a bit of a difference here with Fibermax 1944. As I mentioned, it kind of in between. Here with Delta Pine 1252 and 1538, you cannot tell any difference between the fungicide treated and the non-treated control. There certainly is some target spot in there, as I showed in the slide, but the level of damage is such that it's really having no effect on the yield of either of those varieties. From the work that we've done so far, when you look at the different varieties, it looks like that we need at least 40 to 50% defoliation at about the 1st of September in order to see any substantial reduction in yield, to really show it in a field trial. Of course, with 499 getting up around 80%, it's much easier to show a yield loss in that variety. That doesn't mean that, say, Delta Pine 1538 can't have a problem, but simply this particular year when the study was done, we didn't have enough rain to drive the disease to the point that it damaged that particular variety. We do a lot of variety trials in the state and check them for defoliation, target spot related defoliation when we can. This is just a list of Delta Pine varieties from a study done last year down at Gulf Coast Substation, which is just a couple of miles from Mobile Bay, and you can see sizable difference in the final defoliation levels among these different varieties, with say 1553 and Next Gen 5007 having a lot of defoliation and also having low yields. And there are some varieties like Phytogen 495 had a fair amount of defoliation, but maintained high yield. So there's not 100% association between leaf shed, particularly in this range, and a yield loss. And these are just some Phytogen varieties, again showing a wide range in variation in their response in this particular study. And a particular note, the Phytogen 444 showed what we would consider really good tolerance of target spot in comparison to a lot of the other varieties in the Phytogen line. Based on all the work that we've done at a couple of substations over the past few years with varieties, Phytogen 499 is the most susceptible variety that we've seen to target spot. Among other varieties that generally look good, but where we can see yield response due to fungicide inputs, it would be Delta Pine 1252 and Fiberbax 1944. And then varieties that we very rarely see a response to fungicides simply because the level of defoliation doesn't seem to reach the point where we have significant yield loss, or these other 8 varieties. And actually, over the next year or two, we hope to add a lot more varieties to this particular list. But there are a lot of good choices for growers in the way of cotton varieties to plant that tend to have less problem with target spot than say Phytogen 499. And in fact, in surveys that we've run in Southwest Alabama, basically growers are really only growing varieties on this list, and they're largely these Delta Pine varieties. The next question for varieties is, what about early maturing varieties? These are the varieties that had a lot of issues in the Mid-South. And they're not varieties that are typically grown over a large portion of Alabama. We tend to go to the late maturing and full season varieties, or mid-season and then full season varieties rather than earlies. And some of these Delta Pines at the bottom, 1518 and 1522, and then we have a couple of Phytogen lines. They have similar or less defoliation than some of these mid and full season varieties in the center of the slides from Phytogen. It's hard to say, at least at this point in time, how some of the early season varieties respond to target spot. Our trials are not showing what the growers ran into in the Mid-South. So I think these varieties are going to have to be looked at a lot more carefully in those areas where they're grown under conditions that are very conducive to target spot, to really get an idea of how they're responding to that particular disease, because it's really something that, at least here in Alabama, we've really not been able to get a good handle on at all. So that's something that does need to be done. And then, of course, the next issue when we deal with varieties is the fact that we've got a lot of new varieties come out with advanced, particularly phenoxy herbicide traits, or we're going to have Bollgard 3, Wide Strike 3, so we've got 3 BT traits in varieties, and so they're just coming online. And at this point in time, we really have screened very few of these varieties to target spots. So we really, at this point, don't really have a good idea as to how they might respond to this disease under a high-pressure situation. So we're almost back to square one, as a lot of the varieties I mentioned a moment or two ago are now cycling out of the commercial realm, and we're bringing new varieties in. We're going to have to start our screening process over and to establish what the response of those varieties might be to target spot. Then we get to fungicides, and I mentioned earlier about the dryland cotton that didn't lap the middles and had less than 2 bale yield potential. Those are probably fields that are not ones that we would select to treat with a fungicide. The disease pressure is relatively low in those situations, so it's just kind of hard to justify the use of fungicides in those settings, particularly when you consider that a product like Headline at 6 ounces per acre is going to be, say, $15 per application. So it's hard to justify. So we're really, with a fungicide, we're targeting those fields that have intensively managed, where the disease is likely to occur and where we're getting the rainfall that we need to drive the disease, or rainfall and irrigation. So it's either one. But so we're really only looking at growers that are pushing the limit on their yield of their cotton to really focus on those folks rather than trying to treat every acre of cotton out there. And there's some reasons not to do that anyway. These are the products that are labeled. From our field trials, I probably have to say Pyraxor is probably the leader. Headline has done well, but we've had trials where all of these materials have recorded significant yield gains. But we're just more likely to see them with Pyraxor than maybe some of these other products. And one of the things that's come out of a lot of the trials we've run, and there's really not much of a rate response with any of these fungicides. So usually if you screen a 4-ounce rate and an 8-ounce rate of Pyraxor, for example, you're really not going to see that much difference in the level of disease control or in yield response. The only time you might want to use a higher rate of these materials may be in situations where you make a single application rather than two. And we have some new chemistries coming online. I just wanted to mention those very quickly. And this Adipidan, and then Adipidan plus difenoconazole right here gave excellent control of target spot, and they look much better than most of the other products that we have screened in cotton. So they're actually, we're looking at actually some better products coming on down the pipe. Early on, when we saw target spot develop and saw the pattern of disease development in cotton, one of the options was to maybe use drop nozzles as a means of putting the fungicide down into the canopy rather than just spraying over the top as broadcast spray. Now, this would create problems for the growers, but it may have been an option for improving the efficacy of the fungicides we're using. And we did 4 trials over 2 years at 2 locations, and really only saw a slight improvement in the performance of Quadris and not Headline with the drops. In all the trials that we ran, we only saw a yield gain with Headline in one of the 4 trials. So basically, in the end, there's no need for drop nozzles. We're just going over the top is equally as effective in controlling this disease, reducing the amount of defoliation as is using the drop nozzles. One other possible delivery system that we looked at was a VR irrigation system. This was a test that was run last year in central Alabama, not the highest disease pressure. We had 4 varieties out there, and we used the pivot. We had a ground application with a large Hagan sprayer. This was not a plot sprayer. And we had a non-spray control. And we really didn't have that much disease pressure as we would have liked to have seen out here. But in the end, the pivot system did not compare with the ground applied applications of Pyraxor in controlling target spot in cotton. The disease ratings or defoliation ratings for the pivot and the control on 3 of the 4 varieties were the same. So we'll repeat this study in 2017 to see whether we can, improve the delivery, maybe improve the efficacy. But at least right now, it looks like using a VR system, applying a fungicide like Pyraxor in 0.2 of an inch of water per acre is just not going to pay off. We've looked at application numbers, and it kind of depends on where you are in the United States, whether you really want to angle towards making a single application or 2 applications. This test was done again down in Brewton, which is just above Florida. And We didn't really see that much control with a single application with any of the products that were screened, but we did get a yield bump with the 6-ounce rate of headline over the non-treated control. These were seed yields, not lint yields, by the way. With the 2 spray programs on Phytogen 499, the Pyraxor and the Quadris, both gave a significant yield increase, with the 2 applications of Pyraxor being the best treatment in the study. If you go over to the other variety, the 1137, which we consider tolerant, the Pyraxor single spray actually worked well and gave us an increase in yield. We got an increase in yield with 2 applications of headline, but no reduction in disease. And we got an increase in yield with the 2 applications of Quadris on that variety. And even though the 2 applications of Pyraxor gave us really good disease control, it did not result in a yield bump. So the question of number of sprays is kind of up in the air. I think in South Alabama, where the pressure is high, you have particularly the risk of having a great deal of rainfall into early September. We may be looking more at a 2-spray program, even on a tolerant variety. But if you get into some other areas, either further north in Alabama or up the Mississippi River Valley, maybe they'd be more interested in looking at a single spray program properly timed in order to manage target spot. With fungicide timing is another issue that we're trying to resolve. If you look at the labels of the products that are out there, they state the application should be made at the 1st and 3rd week of bloom. And they really didn't base their language on their label on any research, because prior to the last couple of years, no one had screened any fungicides on cotton for target spot control anyway. That's more of a timing maybe even a little earlier for Ascochyta. So we did a study, we've done 2 of them now, and looked at timing. These are 2 application programs, and this is pinhead square in 1st week of bloom, 1st and 3rd, 3rd and 5th, and 5th and 7th. And it looks like the earlier you initiate your sprays, the poorer control you're going to get. And actually, we tended to get very good control with either the 2 later spray programs, which is kind of unusual because the 3rd and 5th would correspond to the time of disease onset, and the 5th and 7th week of bloom programs would actually be a rescue program. But it turned out they both did very well. But when you look at the yields, on Phytogen 499, even though there was more defoliation on that 1st and 3rd week in bloom, they all had the same yield response. And it turns out on the 1252, there was no difference in yield among any of the treatments, including the non-treated control. So that's still something we need to work on. Now, one of the reasons why you don't want to be spraying all the cotton with a fungicide is the issue of resistance. And it turns out that Corneospora acicula has the ability to very rapidly develop resistance to single-site active fungicides. So there is resistance to azoxystrobin, strobilurins, boscalid, which is an SDHI type. They're just coming out and still coming out in the marketplace. And this fungus has resistance to it in vegetables, and carbendazim and other benzimidazoles. So there's a good argument out there to come up with alternative control measures other than fungicides, or if we use a fungicide, to make sure they're properly timed and used at the right rate in order to reduce the risk that we're going to select for isolates that are resistant to these, generally speaking, fairly effective fungicides we have in the marketplace. So just to summarize the fungicides, Pyraxor probably the most efficacious, with headline bringing up, or pyraclostrobin coming behind it. We could just broadcast over the top. Using the pivot didn't make a difference. Using the drop nozzles didn't make a difference. So that's where we are with placement of the fungicides. Your variety and disease pressure are going to dictate the number of applications. And as I said, you go into South Alabama, even on some of our tolerant varieties, you may be looking at a 2-spray program, whereas you get out of that area, maybe we're only looking at 1. And based on our field trials, it looks like a little bit later timing is better for controlling target spot in cotton. We've had a couple of situations in field trials where we had the first and third week in bloom as spray dates or spray times, and we got some disease control, but really didn't see any differences in yield. So that didn't. It just looks like the first and third are just a hair too early in some situations, and particularly if it's a one spray program, putting an application out the first week in bloom would probably be a waste. This program brings scouting as an option for scheduling fungicide sprays, because as I said, around that third or fourth week is when you really first see the disease come on. So a consultant or grower may be able to scout their cotton, find the disease at the right time, and initiate a spray program. And then, as I said, it looks like the 5th and 7th week of bloom give us an option as a rescue program, where the grower actually does go out and find that his cotton is beginning to defoliate. Again, not severely defoliated. You can initiate a program with some reasonable hope of protecting the yield that he has on the crop, and particularly in a high yield situation where you're more likely to see a sizable yield drop. In some of the other research that we've done, surprisingly, rotation doesn't have that much of an impact. You would think, given the type of disease we're dealing with, foliar leaf spot diseases, rotation tends to be beneficial, but here in the studies that we have ongoing, it doesn't seem to make a difference. This past year, we saw less target spot defoliation in strip than conventional till, Phytogen 499, and it was considerably less. So maybe going to a strip till, particularly stripping into another crop, is the way to go to at least kind of dampen down the amount of defoliation that you might get from target spot. Potash fertility has no impact on this disease. When you talk about some of the Staphylococcus leaf spots and other leaf spot diseases in cotton, there's always an affiliation with a potash deficiency, but that is not the case with target spot. And one other study we tried was looking at reducing the seeding rate to maybe open the canopy up, maybe get a little more air circulation within the canopy as a means of kind of suppressing target spot. The study was done at Gulf Coast Substation, and it didn't matter what the seeding rate was. We had the same levels of defoliation. The only thing that came out of it was, as we reduced the rate, our yields actually went down. So anyway, if anything, reducing the seeding rate had a detrimental effect rather than a positive benefit. So right now, you're talking to growers. I mean, the number one means of managing target spot is to go out there and plant a tolerant variety. The one susceptible variety is an exceptionally good variety. It has very good yield potential and actually yields well in the presence of target spot, but it still gets torn up pretty badly in comparison with some of the other varieties that are out there. We haven't done any nitrogen rate studies with cotton and to look at target spot related defoliation, but that intensively managed high yield cotton is getting a high rate of nitrogen on it. So maybe growers need to kind of look at that a little bit and maybe scale their nitrogen back a little bit as a means of reducing the amount of target spot that they end up with in their cotton. Strip till or no till is fine for cotton. It seems to be better than conventional tillage. And the fungicides need to be can be used as needed based on the yield potential and weather patterns. As I mentioned, they're over the top. We're still, fiddling with the application timing, but certainly I think the first week and third week in bloom is just a hair early. And we have come up with some programs that allow the growers to scout and treat rather than just going on the basis of growth stage. And that needs to be looked at a little further as well. So if there are any questions now, I'd be glad to answer.
You should have a question dialog box if you're a viewer.
Yes, I
in
do
your
have. It's up. It is up.
Okay. For the audience, you should be able to type questions in your control panel. So if there are any questions,
believe I got within a minute.
Oh. Okay, there's one question. When scouting, is there a certain percentage of defoliation that should trigger a fungicide application?
I would say that, when we were doing this, we were probably at relatively low levels of defoliation, maybe 10 to 20%. Because, or maybe even a little less than that. Because you don't want to wait until 30 or 40% of the leaves are lost. I think at that point you already have a problem. But it's probably in that 10% range or something like that. It's when you go out there, you're starting to see the leaves hit the ground, but there are not a lot of them on the ground, and you don't see a lot of spotting all the way up through the canopy. Most of the spotting is still confined to the lower third of the canopy. So the disease hasn't progressed a whole lot, but you do have a little wiggle room in there.
Okay, are there any other questions? All right, there's another question from somebody who missed the first part. Is this a newly emerged disease or an introduced disease?
Ooh, well, we don't know. From what we can tell of the phylogenetic studies on Corneospora cassicula, as I said, that this is a unique strain of the fungus. To our knowledge, it's not been found anywhere else in the world. They have looked at the relationship between the isolates that have come out of cotton in Brazil and those in the United States. And they are not that closely related. They're in the same phylogenetic linkage group, but the ones out of Brazil are closely related to the isolates that we find on soybeans in the United States. But the one that's in cotton is separate. So more than likely, this was a genetic mutation. It may have been that's the original source of the material. So it's probably not it probably didn't come from anywhere else. It's unique to the United States, at least as far as we know at this point in time. Now I will say it's also possible that some of the breeding of cotton varieties may have created a window for the selection of this fungus as well. We don't know that because there's been a lot of we'll call it, there's been a lot of improvement in the yield potential of varieties that we have available today compared to the ones we had 15 years ago. So it's possible that maybe in some way, shape, or form the breeding programs have kind of opened the door for this fungus to move into cotton.
All right, here's another question. Excuse me. Have you ever seen a fungicide applications keep the cotton green and not able to defoliate properly?
I've heard of that. We have not run into it per se in any of our trials. We're going out and putting up to 5 fungicide applications in some of our umbrella spray programs to suppress target spot, and as far as I know, we have had no difficulties in defoliating that cotton. Now we're doing it, most of our trials in South Alabama, and I have to admit that it's not uncommon down there to have to apply defoliant twice, or at least once, and then maybe come back and put a bowl opener on there. So we are having to work a little harder down here to get the leaves off them than you might in some other areas.
Okay, anyone else have any questions? We still have several minutes. All right. How do you tell the difference between regular leaf drop and leaf drop from the target spot? Is it just when you see the target spot in the lower canopy?
Yeah, I mean, you could have cotton varieties shed leaves, and some shed more leaves than others. You can go out there in a perfectly healthy field that's in good condition, and you'll see some leaves starting to senesce off, particularly out of the bottom of the canopy that are associated with the bulbs at the base of the plant. When we evaluate trials, we specifically are looking for leaves that hit the ground with lesions on them. And early on in the middle of July, you have to look very carefully at any of the, in early August, look at the leaves that are sitting on the ground to determine whether or not there's any symptoms or lesions on the leaves. But once you have disease development, basically you're looking through the canopy and you're looking down on the ground at the leaves that have hit the ground, and they're all spotted up. So they're symptomatic. But there are, they're right. There are some situations where cotton will shed leaves and there's no defoliation associated with target spot.
Okay, any other questions? We still have a few minutes. Okay, well, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. So, oh, there is one more.
Yeah.
At what stage of development of the crop should you be safe from yield loss from target spot?
That's that's kind of, I think if there's relatively little defoliation by the middle of August, even though you may see leaf spotting and leaf shed after that point, if the amount of defoliation is fairly low, second and third week in August, I think you're, on a May planted cotton crop, I think once you get to that point, you're fine. Because as I said before, if it occurs very late, basically just prior to the time frame that you're going to defoliate the cotton anyway, it's beneficial. It's that early defoliation, that rapid buildup you see in the middle of August that is responsible for the yield loss. So if you only at 10 or 15, 20%, and you're in the third week in August, you're home free probably.
All right. Not seeing anything yet. Well, if nobody has any other questions, then I think we can adjourn. Oh, there's somebody who said that it's a great webinar.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So, Dr. Hagan, thank you very much for presenting, and
No problem.
everybody, thank you so much for attending. This is the end of the webinar.